Hello and welcome to Blogging Heads TV. My name is Semhar Araia and I'm a guest host for the Worldwise program today. Today we're speaking with Barry Malone, a Reuters correspondent, was based in Ethiopia for over 5 years, and we are discussing the implications of late Prime Minister Meles Zenawi's legacy, his death, the implications for the country and the Horn of Africa region. Barry, are you there?
I am, Semhar. Hello from London. How are you?
Wonderful. It's great to hear you. So tell us, you were in Ethiopia from a very busy period of around 2006 till 2010. Is that right?
Yeah, I came to Ethiopia and sort of in the aftermath of the violence that broke out after the 2005 elections. I arrived in early 2006. I was there through the elections in 2010. And so yeah, I left in November 2010. So I was there almost a 5-year stint. It was a fascinating time in Ethiopian politics. But then, to be honest, I think it's such a fascinating country, and it's one of those countries that's really complex and really interesting and very important in its region and on the continent of Africa, and even wider, further afield. But it's underreported. You take any 5-year segment of Ethiopian history, and if you were a foreign correspondent there, you would have had a pretty fascinating time. But the period that I had between 2005 and 2010, I think was particularly interesting because in 2005 they had an election in which the opposition declared victory, the government also declared victory. There were protests on the streets, and what ended up happening was there were riots. 193 people were killed by the security forces, and the opposition leaders were jailed. So I came in after that period when things were still quite tense, and we were leading up to an election in 2010.
And what's interesting about that period of time is there was such controversy over the elections internationally, and yet for people who were inside the country, there were so many more other issues arising, not just from the election fallout, but also the basic needs economically, some of the political dynamics. One thing I'll say is, having been based between Washington and the Horn, the conversations around what Ethiopia's agenda should be post-2005, it varied widely. I would say that in the West, there was quite a bit of attention on developmental goals, economic growth, as well as the fallout from the 2005 elections. But internally, there was also quite a bit of debate about its political direction and its needs across the country, not just in the center.
Yeah, I think what happened was that the 2005 elections came along and kind of put a spanner in the works of all that development, that good development work that you're talking about. You had all these countries that were engaged in Ethiopia. You had the United States, you had Great Britain, you had major international NGOs, the UN, and they were pumping development money into Ethiopia, which is one of the poorest countries in the world. They believed that they had a government who was listening to them, who they could do business with, a government that was effective, a government that was scoring big in terms of development. They were reducing infant mortality rates. They had introduced a safety net program, which, although it hadn't eradicated sort of hunger in the country, what it had done was kind of ensured that famine of 1984-85, that probably Ethiopia is still best known for, sadly, in the West, that famine of 84-85 would never be repeated. I mean, you were in a position where there was sort of 13 million, varying year to year, but I remember, one figure I have from maybe midway through my period there, where there's 13 million Ethiopians reliant on foreign aid. So obviously that's not an ideal situation, but what the government had done was ensure that hundreds of thousands of people were not going to starve to death like happened in the mid-80s. So there was all this progress being made. And the Western governments felt like they had an ally in Meles Zenawi, who, as you say, has recently died, and in his government. But then, when 2005 happened and 193 people were killed in the streets and the opposition were thrown into prison, I think it was a problem. It was a problem for the relationships that Meles had externally. It was a problem for the governments who were doing business with him. It was a problem for the NGOs, for the UN. It was a problem for everybody. And the question was, well, how do we proceed with this relationship now?
Yeah, it's really fascinating what you just raised about sort of the reputation or the legacy that Ethiopia was unfortunately known for in the West was the 84-85 famine. And we should say from the outset, neither you or I are Ethiopian But having lived and worked in the region in different periods of time, we've seen transformation on various levels in Ethiopia and in the region. So I mean, I think even between us, there's only so much that we were able to capture about Ethiopia's transformation, its leadership. And this is really from our own observations as analysts and, as in your case, as a journalist. What's fascinating to me is that point about the legacy of the famine and the government of Ethiopia's focus on promoting an economic development plan that would actually prevent a future famine from happening, and taking great steps to make sure that there weren't millions starving again in the horrific images we saw from Live Aid and from that period of time. In your time, you were covering all sorts of issues inside the country, and ranging from politics to the government's own developmental priorities. You also got to see Meles Zenawi in different spaces and different meetings. Tell us a little bit about your dealings with him and what you observed in his demeanor.
Well, yeah, I mean, during my normal, the normal work that I carried out, as a foreign correspondent, obviously I would have encountered Meles Zenawi several times. I had several sort of one-on-one interviews with him where he would sit down with us and we would speak to him one-on-one for maybe an hour, maybe more than an hour, probably once a year. And he held bi-monthly press conferences that we would attend, and in one very shallow way, you got to know him sort of through those, and you could figure out the issues that were important to him, the issues that riled him, the issues that he wanted to talk about, the issues that he didn't want to talk about. Also, on election day 2010, I travelled with him to his hometown of Adwa when he went to vote. And I had a good conversation with him on the plane on the way back from there. So I had several encounters with him and several conversations with him, and he was a very divisive figure, but also he was a fascinating figure. He had an incredible life. At the age of 19, he dropped out of medical school. He went to join a rebel group in the bush. He fought against with the communist regime, the Derg they were known as. The Derg had the biggest army in Africa at the time. Meles was part of a rebel group that fought them for 17 years. And then a coalition of rebel groups finally managed to overthrow them. After some horse trading about how they would form a new government, Meles emerged first as transitional president at, I think, the age of 34. Yeah. And then a few years later, he became a prime minister. And so effectively, he was in power from 1991 until his death. Where are we now? Was it last month?
Yeah, it was August 20th.
Yeah, until his death in August. So, so it was incredible life, and it was a life wrapped up in Ethiopian politics and wrapped up in idealism about how Ethiopia could look. And this was a man who, from the age of 19 until his death in August, that was all that he did. That was all that drove him. You could certainly get that sense from being around him. He was driven, he was an ideologue, he had a vision about how he wanted Ethiopia to progress and what he wanted Ethiopia to be. I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy recently in which I said that he didn't like anyone standing in his way. And I think that when the criticism of him about his human rights record, about how he cracked down on the opposition, about how he cracked down on the media, and didn't give them room to breathe. That came from his fervent self-belief that he was the man who could transform Ethiopia, that he was going to lead this Ethiopian Renaissance, and that anybody who stood in his way was an enemy of that goal.
Yeah. Look, for our viewers who maybe aren't familiar with Ethiopia's recent history or even the region, let me just give a quick overview. Ethiopia is the largest country in the Horn of Africa, which is in northeast Africa. It's bordered by Sudan, Kenya, Somalia, and Eritrea to the north. It's a population of over 80 million people, with hundreds of ethnic groups and different dialects. The official language is Amharic, and it's actually been one of the two African countries that were not colonized. A brief period of Italian administration in Addis Ababa. But Ethiopia's legacy has been one of strong leadership and diplomatic engagement with the world, oftentimes with accusations of repression of minority groups and heavy-handed authoritative governments. In the modern history, from you would say 1940s till 1974, Ethiopia was under the rule of Emperor Haile Selassie, who was quite progressive in his vision for the country, in the sense that he brought the first airplane, TWA, brought the Ford, began doing trade.
Famous first motor car, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, during that era, it was remarkable to see an African country engage with the West, for instance, at the League of Nations, standing up to the colonizers. And in many ways, that was sort of it was inspiring to see African leadership on the global sphere. But truthfully, in the region, many groups knew that leadership came at a price, particularly for those underrepresented and marginalized ethnic groups. As a result of that type of governance, actually Ethiopia had found itself in a war with the North, with Meles Zenawi's group, at that time known as the Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, taking up arms against the Derg, who had ousted Haile Selassie in 1974. So the 70s were a period of heavy revolution. Youth were being frustrated at the lack of economic opportunities, job creation. The country had experienced a drought on massive scales throughout different parts of the country, and there was growing frustration with the emperor's leadership. So the communist regime that actually came in 74 came along the backs of the youth and the revolution. And initially was widely accepted, embraced by the next generation of Ethiopians, I would say. I mean, and it depends who you talk to in Ethiopia about the views towards the Derg. But within a matter of 1 to 2 years, it became very clear that this was not only a brutal dictator, but one that was also willing to use violence against its own people.
Incredibly brutal, yeah, incredibly brutal. I think, the Derg were an amazingly brutal regime, and that again is a story that you don't hear so often outside of Ethiopia. I think when you talk to people about Ethiopia, they don't know that history, that that Ethiopia in the late 70s had its own Red Terror, in which by some estimates, maybe more than 100,000 people, maybe even more, were killed who were opponents of the government. It was really an incredibly dark time for the country.
It was incredibly dark, and it was actually one of the first instances that we would say massive war crimes are being committed against people, genocide and ethnic cleansing. It's a claim that still is being raised today by Ethiopians around the world who have lost loved ones. And within that attacks on civilians, also the TPLF and other rebel groups grew in their size and in their focus, and that's really where I think the rise of Meles began, was in the field, in the bush, as you said. And from that until 1991, the TPLF was one of the leading rebel groups inside Ethiopia. It's also important to note that it was alongside the Eritrean People's Liberation Front, which is now present-day Eritrea. And so there were relationships there that had actually, alongside, they fought together the same dictator. And so by 1991, I mean, for the American audience, let's think about this. It's the fall of communism, the end of the Cold War. The communist dictator in Ethiopia is ousted, and we've got this new emerging leader in Ethiopia. The TPLF takes on the helm. And from 91 until at least 98, there is a remarkable period of economic growth, of strengthening of regional relations, of advancements in good governance and transparency, and even multi-party systems. And Ethiopia had held elections in 95 and in 2000, fairly non-controversially.
Very poorly contested, as well.
Right. And concurrently, Eritrea and Ethiopia, who were on their way towards establishing bilateral relations, the Second War had erupted in 1998 to 2000. And it's really since 2000, and particularly post 9/11, that we see Ethiopia's government agenda really sort of massively expand in terms of economic growth and development, but also at the international arena. Meles Zenawi was one of the first African governments to step up and offer a partnership with the United States on the global war on terror. And between 9/11, between 2001 until 2005, there was a sort of growing strategic alliance with the United States, one that had existed before, but particularly amplified because of efforts to counterterrorism in the Horn. What's remarkable is what 2005 means, and the surgence of opposition groups right at the height of Ethiopia becoming a war on terror ally. We saw gross violations against people. 193 people killed during the 2005 elections, and many would say that the government really just got a slap on the wrist for its abuses and its crimes, because it was at the trade-off was that they would be this ally. And I don't know, Meles didn't take too kindly to those claims, but he was very insistent that this is all about a long-term development plan, and this was not, right?
No, absolutely. He wasn't, I think there's a simplistic explanation of this, where, in the Western media what they say is, here you had this Prime Minister who saw the war on terror as an opportunity. He saw it as an opportunity to pursue his own regional ambitions, to crack down on internal opposition, and to get a free pass from his Western supporters, from his Western donors, to do so. I think there is some truth in that, but I think that readout of the situation underestimates the sort of leader that Meles Zenawi was, the sort of government that he was at the helm of. There were some other powerful people behind Meles as well, primarily in the central committee of as you mentioned, the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, who after Meles came to power led a coalition that ran Ethiopia. The coalition being the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, the EPRDF. Mm-hmm. The TPLF was the lead party in that alliance, and Meles is the leader of that party. But there's a very powerful committee that also exists within that party. I think that all those men who ran that party, they're pretty independent-minded, and Meles is pretty independent-minded too. None of the things that he did, going into Somalia to oust this Islamist group, the Islamic Courts Union, who had taken over most of the country in 2007, 2008, I think that the Ethiopian government's decision to go in and oust that group, a lot of people say that it was US-sponsored. It probably had tacit US approval, but, make no mistake, we're talking about Meles Zenawi and what kind of a leader he was, and he would not have done that if he didn't think that it was in Ethiopia's interests to do so. He's fiercely independent. And, you spoke earlier on about Emperor Haile Selassie and the way that he stood up against imperialism and the amazing speeches that he made at the League of Nations and what a statesman he had become for Africa. Mm. And I think there was an element of that to Meles, or certainly Meles had ambitions to be that sort of an African statesman too. And he certainly didn't want to be told what to do by the United States. He certainly didn't want to be told what to do by the West. And even latterly, what he tried to do was to build relationships with China, to build relationships with India, even maybe to build some relationships with Turkey, and then to play those countries off the West, off the United States, off Britain. But even as he got closer to China and India, I think he always maintained that Ethiopian independence that Ethiopians are so proud of.
Well, no, actually, that's really interesting. You said that. What is so what many people don't understand is this region, its leaders, its governments, they're very long-term vision looking.
Yeah.
They're very, it isn't about 4 years or 5 years or 10. It's about 20, 30, and 50.
20,
yeah. And so Meles showed this, as did previous Ethiopian leaders. The same can be said about Isaias Afwerki in the Eritrean government. The same could be said even down south to Uganda with Museveni and Rwanda. These are leaders who, are not being taken for a ride by donors or Westerners. It's actually sometimes
they're no puppets.
That's right.
I think is the key.
That's right. And a lot of times, I think people underestimate sort of the real agenda and goals of these leaders. And you're with Somalia. It's a perfect example. In 2006, when the Islamic Courts Union had taken over Mogadishu, and with much of the backing of Somali people, many would say, to Ethiopia, there's a definite national security threat there because of if Somalia's rise inside Somalia were to take place, it would obviously bring in measures of instability for Region 5, as it's known in Ethiopia, the Ogaden, and for many Somalis, this is the issue of Greater Somalia. And so regionally, Meles was very good at managing and tamping down pockets of potential instability ahead of time. And in this case, because it fell in line with broader global aspirations to fight counter to fight terrorism, Meles became the lead ally. And today we look back on that.
It was convenient. I mean, he's a
Yeah.
man who they knew they could do business with.
Yeah.
He's very shrewd. He's very clever. His goals for Ethiopia and their goals aligned. You know, Ethiopia is the military force in the region as well. I mean, that's really important to note that they're the military force. And so, for the United States, even for China's now trying to get in there and get some influence. Of course, they want a close relationship with the Horn of Africa's military force, with East Africa's military force. But I don't think that Meles and Ethiopia are unique in that regard. In terms of here's a country who's a strategic ally of some Western nations, where there are very serious human rights abuses, yet you don't hear much criticism from the Western countries about those human rights abuses. I mean, there are loads of countries around the world, and even within the region, that we see the same thing. Uganda, you could argue, has a similar relationship with the West, and Rwanda, you could argue, has a similar relationship with the West. So he wasn't unique, but he was very clever at playing the game and playing the West of new allies like China and like India.
When we look at Ethiopia's development under Meles's rule, we saw pockets where it just shot up exponentially in terms of road development, access to healthcare, education. We saw building of the new dam most recently, and at the same time, Ethiopia is still the fourth largest recipient of U.S. humanitarian aid in the world, just after Sudan, Afghanistan, and Iraq. There's still a great need of humanitarian assistance, while there's concurrently development projects. You saw a little bit of the development projects that were underway while you were there. Can you tell us a bit about it? Maybe either the dam, the Gibe Dam, or the hydropolitics that were such a part of the daily life there.
Yeah, I mean, it was very genuine. I traveled all around the country. I've been to, in the nearly 5 years I was there, I've been to every corner of Ethiopia, and at varying intervals over that 5-year period. I especially remember traveling around in the lead up to the 2010 elections and going to towns and villages that I'd been to before, maybe 2-3 years before, and seeing that they now had a road, they now had a tarmac road, or they now had clean drinking water, or they'd been electrified,
right,
or there was a mobile phone mast. All very, very key and very, very important indicators of development for a country like Ethiopia. And that was genuinely happening, across most parts of the country. And when I would travel to those towns and villages, the local people were very grateful that was happening. Having said that, there were other places, because it's a vast country. You said that this is a country of more than 18 million people. It's a huge, huge country. And so there were other parts of it, maybe the Ogaden region, Region 5 you mentioned, the Somali region, that were less developed. And in those places, you could see very clearly that Ethiopia was still one of the poorest countries in the world. And what Meles managed to achieve was, double-digit growth. Well, the Ethiopian government says for the last 7 years in a row. The IMF has a slightly lower estimate, but it's still a very impressive estimate for economic growth. Critics of Meles, critics of his economic policies will tell you that, and I think this is also a very valid criticism that I've seen play out around the country too, was that the amount of growth wasn't always apparent in an improvement in the standards of living of all the people.
Right, right.
So you still had some very, very, very poor people in Ethiopia. Right. And I think, Semhar, you're probably more of an expert in this than me, but I think that the Ethiopian model was a very top-down approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Rather than a bottom-up approach. I
mean, I think there's real questions about what is good development, what is sustainable development, what does it actually mean to have a road and have a school, but at the same time not have the same rights-based issues also protected. I think Ethiopia is fascinating because while there's double-digit growth, as the government asserts, there's also pockets where we really aren't able to get the data to say, well, in this region, it may contrast that, it may contradict it. Additionally, what I find really fascinating is particularly I think since 2005, there's been a shift in the way the government engages with its local communities and in particular its civil society groups, where flourishing, very vibrant up until that period of time, one would say that for fears of probably civil society supporting opposition and human rights issues, there were a series of laws just introduced over 5 years on media, access to information, civil society and charities funding laws, which generally really restricted the kind of rights-based approaches that do exist in development work. And
I think that's really interesting, actually. You know, most of the criticism of Meles Zenawi centers upon that period from 2005 to 2010.
Yeah.
You know, the period after the election that for Meles, you know, what Meles critics say is that, you know, the EPRDF and Meles, they lost that election in 2005, and their response to losing the election was to shoot protesters dead in the streets and to throw the leaders of the opposition and all of the most prominent journalists in prison.
Yeah.
I think that there's a pretty valid debate about who may have won the election and who didn't. I mean, to be honest, in the 5 years that I lived in the country, I never satisfied myself as to who actually won the election in 2005. It seems clear, though, that it was incredibly close. That becomes less important who won when you see the reaction. You know, the reaction, many people could argue, was over the top in that it resulted in all of the main leaders of the opposition and most of the prominent journalists in the country ended in prison. But I think what's really interesting, you know, you're talking about a crackdown that came after 2005. You know, when people talk about the lead up to the 2005 elections, they were so excited. Now, here you had a country that had this such a proud, such a storied, such a wonderful history. Like you say, you know, one of only 2 countries in Africa never to be colonized, and you know, a long history of very advanced civilizations that existed in Abyssinia, which is now Ethiopia, and Ethiopians are rightly proud of their history. And here seemed a historic moment where, you know, they thought that for the first time they would have a genuinely democratic election.
Right.
And you had newspapers springing up everywhere. You know, there were hundreds of newspapers apparently. There's great stories I heard of Ethiopians gathering around in Addis Ababa and, you know, putting their money together to buy a newspaper, and then 6 men all gathered around trying to find out the latest election news. The Ethiopia that I moved to in 2006, post that period, after all the opposition politicians had been imprisoned, was very, very different. There was no free media really to speak of. Journalists were very, very scared about how they operated. And so from the period I was there from 2006 to end of 2010, it only got worse over that period.
Yeah.
You know, as a foreign correspondent, we had a lot more freedom. We had a lot more leeway. The tiny group of us who were there, you know, there's only 6 or 7 of us there. But even we were constantly, our work was constantly monitored, constantly watched, constantly evaluated. You know, we could be called into the Ministry of Information and hauled over the coals. You know, I was called in one time and they highlighted sentences of my stories that they didn't like, that they wanted me to explain. You know, so there was a very tight atmosphere there, and the government was not allowing any free press to develop. And as you say, you know, pre-2005 that had been happening, but then after 2005 the government seen it as a threat, and they clearly decided that it was time to crack down, not only on the media but on the opposition. And a lot of the criticism of Meles stems from that period. And of course the thing that, you know, will probably be raised most by his critics is the horrible incident, you know, a couple of incidents where 193 people were killed for protesting the result of the 2005 elections, you know.
Let's put it in perspective, though. Again, I keep thinking about the whole region and why this is important, because when you look at 2000 and the difference from 2000 to 2005, this is more than just elections. This is more than just opposition groups. From my lens, and having talked to many Ethiopians and also Eritreans and Somalis in the region and in the diaspora, there was a shift in internal politics on the expectations of what Meles should have delivered, what the TPLF should have delivered. From 2000, you have to remember they had just ended this massively brutal war with Eritrea over a border which really no one knew about the border beforehand. And from 98 to 2000, Meles and the EPRDF had waged a war against Eritrea. And there were critics on both sides saying, why are we in this war? What is this really about? And subsequently, they had signed a peace agreement which was backed by the United States, brokered by the United States. Meles was, in the eyes of many critics, viewed as appeasing to the Eritrean secession, was viewed as being soft and giving up too early. There were those who wanted to take back Eritrea, so to speak, which flies in the face of the whole history of Eritrea's independence. But people felt that by virtue of Ethiopia being landlocked, it left it at a serious disadvantage, and it needed to regain its access to the sea. That period of 2005, when the war ended, until the next elections in 2005, Meles was really under internal pressure, not just because of the border war, but also because of internally expectations of job creation, employment. In 2000, I remember much of the election, he hinged his election around Badme. In addition to promising things domestically, there was this belief that Badme was over, and they had essentially won. And when the border decision came down in 2002, the controversy erupted again over what was this war all over about. Mm-hmm. By 2005, I think the climate inside the country had changed, had matured in many ways. The flourishing of opposition groups was a massive indication of the multi-party system really taking root. But when those elections and the killings happened, it was, I would say, the response was not as harsh as many would have expected. And then what you saw...
You mean the response from the Ethiopian donors, or a response from the international community?
Yeah, from the international community, because the donors at that time had a relationship with Ethiopia, but really it was about regional interests and familiarity with what was happening in Ethiopia, I would say. But by 2005 to 2010, you saw Meles suddenly be on the ECA with Tony Blair, and more recently you saw him at Copenhagen. I mean, he was really adept. I also believe he went on a mission to sort of rebrand his legacy in light of 2005, and with a war to the north that was controversial, the tensions with Somalia, the internal pressures he was facing within the parties, it really became apparent that his agenda was to also ramp up his international reputation. And that's really, I feel like the last 7 years is when we really saw Meles work the international stage.
He was good at that.
Yeah.
He was a very good statesman, it has to be said. I know his opponents will question that, but he was good on the international stage, and it wasn't his Western sponsors always who gave him that platform. It was his fellow African leaders.
That's right.
This was a guy who was often chosen by his fellow African leaders to represent the whole continent. To represent the whole continent at G20 meetings, mm-hmm. to represent the whole continent at climate change negotiations, and it was true those forums and others. The African Union, as well, it's important to know, is based in Addis Ababa, which gave Meles an extra bit of influence at the African Union. Also, I think it's fair to say, and I think a lot of people would agree, that he was an incredibly sharp leader, and that was recognized by his other leaders. And I think that's one of the reasons why he was often given this continental leadership role, and that gave him that sort of statesman, that ability to play the statesman on the international stage, and also with Western leaders. I struggle to respond to why the West didn't respond more harshly when 193 people were killed in the post-election violence in 2005. I think some of them briefly withdrew aid. There was a bluff that Meles called a bluff.
Yeah.
Meles said,
yeah.
"Well, take the aid."
Yeah, I think that's right. There was an immediate response in terms of shock and
yeah, threats. It didn't last very long.
Yeah,
Meles said, "Well, take the aid away. Thank you very much. Thanks for all your help, and we'll be okay. Thank you." And very quickly, those Western donors came back.
Mm-hmm. That's true.
And maybe you're right. Maybe they were unwilling to sacrifice this key ally with the biggest military in the region, whose interests seemed aligned with theirs. There's a more cynical point of view that some people take, which is that, honestly, for some Western governments, 193 people killed in an African post-election scenario is not that big of a deal.
Yeah, there's some who will say that that's just par for the course.
That's a cynical viewpoint,
but
that's, you know, a lot of people say that just, you know, that's not something that really registers on a Western radar, you know.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's funny. I've heard actually people off the record explain that the relationship with Ethiopia isn't a strategic one; it's a security-based one, and that the relationship with Ethiopia isn't intended to be all of these many things. It's primarily driven on shared interests over security, which is more recent in the last two to 3 years.
And important to note that those interests are shared.
Yeah,
you know,
it's very
like
important.
I said earlier, and like you said, in a more regional context, Horn of Africa leaders and East Africa leaders, they don't tend to be puppets of anyone. They tend to be very, very independent.
Yeah.
And so the interest that Meles in Ethiopia had, and the interest that, like he's saying, Museveni has, or Kagame in Rwanda has, or Isaias Afwerki in Eritrea has, you know, whenever their interests have been aligned with donors, you know, that's what we're dealing with. We're dealing with aligned interests. We're not dealing with puppet African governments.
Right.
So, you know, that hasn't been the case with these men.
And out of all of those leaders you just mentioned, it's striking that Meles died so unexpectedly because he was actually the youngest one. And
the youngest, yeah.
And in his case, he had an undisclosed illness, which we still don't know what it was. But he'd been out of the limelight and actually not seen in public since the G20 meetings in June in Mexico. And suddenly disappeared for 59 days before it was announced that he was overseas with an illness. And do you remember, where were you when they made the announcement?
That he was dead.
Yeah.
I was in Iraq. To be honest, I now work primarily in the Middle East. And so I was in Baghdad, you know, when I heard the news, and I was quite shocked by it, I have to say. I'd heard the rumours like everybody else, but I think having lived in Ethiopia so long, and common with a lot of Ethiopians, the news was a huge shock to me. I don't think anybody imagined that the Meles story would end this way. You know, like I said earlier, this was a man who went to the bush at 19, who was part of a group of people who fought a war for 17 years, who led Ethiopia from 1991 until he died in August, and was a figure who I think we'd all debated and we'd all analysed and we'd all tried to project forward. You know, what would his end be? Would he go on for another 5 years? Would he retire at the end of 5 years? Would he try and cling on for another 5 more? If he did, what would the impact be internally in Ethiopia? Would there be a putsch against him? You know,
right.
Right. And so for him to just die of an illness, I think it was shocking. I think it was more shocking for Ethiopians. You know, you'd have seen that there was, I watched on Ethiopian state television. Streaming from Baghdad over the couple of days after the announcement was made that he was dead. I watched their coverage, and you will have seen that there was an outpouring of grief and shock from a lot of Ethiopians. I know that critics are saying, well, this was something that the government stirred up. I don't know. I think that you know, he had his detractors, but he also clearly had his supporters in Ethiopia, and they were very, very grief-stricken and very, very shocked. And also, I think it's one of those countries where they haven't had that many leaders.
Yeah, this was actually the first head of state funeral for the country because
absolutely.
Yeah, Haile Selassie had been what we later discovered he was murdered, and then Mengistu is living in exile to this day in Zimbabwe, and so this is a real shock, I think, to everyone in the region, but also for the Ethiopians who had heard these rumors for so long. There's many who are saying we should have known what he was sick with, what the process would be like, and today it's nearly a month since he's passed. And we're waiting for his acting deputy prime minister to be sworn in. Of course, the country had also simultaneously experienced the death of their patriarch, the head of the Orthodox Church, within the same week. So they've Ethiopians have said, we've lost our pope and our president, and there's a real truth to that. But for those that
actually, it's interesting, the secrecy around it, because the secrecy around it indicates something of the kind of government that the Ethiopian government has become. You know, a government in which the head of state becomes ill, in which he misses an African Union meeting, which he'd never missed an African Union meeting.
He was supposed to chair that meeting.
They say he's having a rest, or they say he's ill but he'll be back soon, and then even when he dies, they don't reveal, what illness he's died from.
Right.
I think it was a great illustration of what a secretive, close, tied-up government the Ethiopian government has become. So careful, so scared and so frightened of any opposition, of any free flow of information, and I think that's unfortunate. Ethiopia, as we've touched on by mentioning its history, is a great country, with a proud history. And I think when Meles and the other groups who were aligned to him and to the TPLF overthrew the communist regime in 1991, I think a lot of Ethiopians hoped that things would change, that as you mentioned earlier, that a multi-party democracy would develop. And really that hasn't been the case. And now with the death of Meles, all the Ethiopians are left with is more uncertainty. Right. About how their political process will develop in the future, and I think that's quite sad.
Well, I would argue that uncertainty extends to the whole region, because what we also have, which we didn't get to mention yet, was the implications of the war with Eritrea have more or less left the two countries in complete frozen relations, and these two leaders, who once are known as brothers, now are enemies, don't speak to each other, and more importantly, beyond the two individuals of Meles and Isaias, there's a reality now that its neighbor to the north, Ethiopia does not have relations with its neighbor to the north. The country's landlocked, and has created access to the sea through Djibouti and through Somalia. But the problem is also that there's still interest in defining what the relationship with Eritrea should be. There's regional implications of Meles. By Meles being gone, Ethiopia has pretty much lost its key negotiator with anything regarding Eritrea. And in Somalia, the same as well. Meles was very hands-on and involved in Somalia. And now, as we look at sort of who the new leadership will be, there's real questions about Ethiopia's agenda regionally and how it will pursue its needs for security and development and access to the sea when the key architect is gone. And so I think it's also a very nervous time for people in the region.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the real question is will anything change?
Mm-hmm.
Have we reached a status what does it mean that Meles' deputy, Haile Mariam Desalegn, it appears to be about to take power? How much real power does he actually have, I think, is the key question. As I mentioned earlier, you have the ruling party in Ethiopia, which holds 545 seats in the 547 member parliament. And the Ethiopian, so effectively we're dealing with a one-party state. Right. That party is the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front. The party within that party that drives things is the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. So I think what a lot of people are wondering is, and this new Prime Minister, Haile Mariam Desalegn, doesn't come from that party. So I think what a lot of people are wondering is how much power will he actually have, or will things still be run from the TPLF Central Committee, i.e. will it just be business as usual? Yeah. It may just be business as usual, within Ethiopia, and the policy platform that Meles put together will likely be pursued. But I think you hit upon a very interesting point there, which is that Meles was the chief architect of so much. Yeah. Regardless of whether the EPRDF, the TPLF, or Haile Mariam Desalegn pursue the Meles agenda, Meles was such a micromanager that you have to suppose that without him, things will be different. I heard some stories in Addis Ababa. I remember a couple of years ago they had a state dinner for Sudan's President Omar al-Bashir, and Meles apparently came into the dining hall before the state dinner was to begin and asked them to change the brand of mineral water that they had on the tables. Wow. This is the level to which this man micromanaged everything. And so with him gone, I think that it wouldn't be hard to suppose that some of Ethiopia's influence will also be lost, because a lot of the influence that he built for Ethiopia in the region and further afield, sure, some of it was because Ethiopia had such a big military. A lot of it was because Ethiopia's interests were aligned with whoever's interests at a particular time. But also a lot of it was driven by that man and that man's personality and that man's kind of shrewdness. Whereas Haile Mariam Desalegn he's more of a bureaucrat.
And he was new. He had been appointed not even a year ago. People said that Meles was grooming him and had selected him from this minority group to make a point that we are trying to intentionally diversify and expand our representation. But Haile Mariam hadn't really been in the leadership position that long.
Yeah, I was surprised. I didn't. I was surprised, to be honest. I was surprised when he was appointed the deputy, and I'm surprised. You know, if you had told me a few years ago that Haile Mariam Desalegn would be the Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Prime Minister designate of Ethiopia, I would have been surprised.
Yeah.
You know, like I say, he's a technocrat.
Yeah.
By all accounts, a very clever technocrat, very good at his job, but a leader. Difficult to imagine a leader in the mold of Meles. I think most Ethiopians would agree he's not. You know, there's some shoes to fill that he probably you know won't be able to fill. And I think so. You know, what we're looking at there, if they pursue the same policy agenda, what we're looking at there is the loss of a big personality. And regardless of whether this should be the case or not, I think that we all know that the loss of such a big personality in politics can often have a huge impact. I think it would be nonsensical for me and you to sit here today and try to imagine what that impact will be, but there will surely be an impact.
Yeah, there's fears that there will be a power vacuum of sorts because of that. Those shoes were so big to fill. There's also
or a skill vacuum, you know.
Yeah, skill. That's right. Yeah. Or at least there's already concerns that why it's taken so long to have him sworn in. You know, despite the other developments in the country, there's real fears that if Haile Mariam isn't empowered early on to begin taking the leadership, that it could cause more fissures inside the party over. Or
that there will be power struggles within the EPRDF, that there will be power struggles within the TPLF. Yeah, I mean, that could happen.
Yeah, yeah. Well, Barry, really want to thank you for your time, and really enlightening and fascinating to hear your stories from the region. I think for all of us, we're really just sitting and wondering what's next for Ethiopia, and the loss is a significant one for the region and for the world. I think we also need to remember that this is a country that is strategically important, not just because of its size and location, but because of its engagement with throughout the Horn and around the world. So this was very helpful, and we really enjoyed talking to you.
Thanks, Semhar. It was really, really great talking to you too.
Yeah, thank you. Everyone, that was Blogging Heads TV Worldwise with Barry Malone from Reuters, and we want to thank you for joining us.